We talked a little bit about phrases last week. This week, we're going to look at them in more detail. We will look at what a phrase is, which parts it can be made up of, and what the different types of phrase are in English. As we said last week, a phrase is essentially a group of words which belong together as a unit. They fill a single slot in a larger structure, like a clause or another phrase. And they can't be broken up into bits that can be moved around separately. Look at this sentence. After the inspiring lecture, the excited students thanked the visiting teacher from an overseas university. We can move some parts of this sentence around. For example, we can say, the excited students thanked the visiting teacher from an overseas university after the inspiring lecture. But there are certain chunks within the sentence which need to be kept together. The excited students thanked the visiting teacher from an overseas university and after the inspiring lecture. If we break these chunks up, the result is gibberish. Lecture inspiring the after thanked university teacher and students the excited visiting the from overseas. That makes no sense at all. The reason for this is that the sentence isn't just made up of individual words strung together. It is made up of phrases, chunks of words that belong together and do a single job in the sentence. Thanked the visiting teacher from an overseas university tells you what someone did. The excited students are the ones doing the thanking. And after the inspiring lecture tells you when this happened. Now look at these examples. Peter is my father. That tall man who is walking down the street is my father. In the second example, the string of words, that tall man who is walking down the street, is doing the same job as Peter is in the first example. It refers to the person who is my father. In grammatical terms, it is the subject of the clause, the entity that the rest of the clause is saying something about. So it is a group of words which is doing a single job in the clause. You could replace the whole group with a single word and the clause would still make sense. This is a phrase. In fact, we also call a single word which is doing a particular job in the sentence a phrase. So Peter in the first sentence is also a phrase. It's just a phrase that only has a single word in it. Heads and modifiers. In every phrase, no matter how long or short it is, there is a single word which is the most important word for the meaning of the whole phrase. If we go back to the phrase, that tall man who is walking down the street, the most important word in this phrase is man. This is because that tall man who is walking down the street refers to a kind of man. It does not refer to a kind of tall or a kind of walking or a kind of street. All these words are optional. The really essential word, if we want to understand what this phrase refers to, is man. I could leave most of the other bits out and just say that man, and I would still be able to use the phrase to refer to the same thing. But man can't be left out. We can't say that tall who is walking down the street. So man is the most important word in this phrase, the one which tells us what the whole phrase is about. We call this word the head of the phrase. All phrases have to have a head. This is a very important point to remember. For most phrase types, the head is the only thing that they have to have. That is, it's fine for a phrase to be made up of just a head and nothing more. But usually, phrases have other words in them, in addition to the head. These additional words tell us something more about the head. In grammatical terms, we say that they modify the head, and so these additional optional parts of a phrase are called modifiers. In the phrase, that tall man who is walking down the street, tall is a modifier because it says something more about man, which is the head. Who is walking down the street is also a modifier because it also says something more about the head. Tall comes before the head that it modifies, so it's called a pre-modifier, pre meaning before. Who is walking down the street comes after the head that it modifies, so it's called a post modifier. Post meaning after. So we can think of a phrase as looking like this. Optional pre-modifier, obligatory head, optional post modifier. When we start looking at the different types of phrases that we find in English, you will see that nearly all of them have this basic structure. There is always a head, and optionally there can be one or more pre-modifiers in front of the head and one or more post modifiers after the head. The difference between the different types of phrases is what kinds of words can go in each slot. It is the part of speech of the head which decides which kind of phrase we have. We said that in the phrase, "that tall man who is walking down the street," the head is man. Man is a noun, and this means that the phrase, "that tall man who is walking down the street," is a noun phrase. It is a noun phrase because its head is a noun. Let's look at another kind of phrase. Broke the windows in Mr. Jackson's greenhouse. This phrase refers to a kind of breaking something, not, for example, a kind of windows or a kind of greenhouse. So broke is the head of this phrase because it's the most important word for the meaning of the phrase. Broke is a verb. So broke the windows in Mr. Jackson's greenhouse is a verb phrase. In the phrase extremely happy to have passed the exam, the most important word is happy. This is the word that tells us what the phrase is about. So happy is the head of this phrase. Happy is an adjective. So extremely happy to have passed the exam is an adjective phrase. In the phrase in the car, the head is in. In the car doesn't really talk about the car as such. It refers to a particular location with respect to the car. The word that tells us what this location is in. So in is the head of this phrase. In is a preposition. So in the car is a prepositional phrase. We'll look at the different types of phrases in more detail very shortly. However, you can see that in order to correctly identify the different phrase types, you need to be able to figure out what the part of speech of the head of the phrase is. If you're still struggling with the different parts of speech, we recommend that you go back and revise that content before moving on to the next module.